What I'm gonna tell you is the best known story in the Southwest. Not just the best known ghost story, but by far the best known story. Anywhere you go in Texas or Arizona or New Mexico or California or Southern Colorado, anywhere in Mexico or Central America, they know about La Llorona. It means the crying woman, the weeping woman, La Llorona. Of course, everywhere you go, they have a different story. And they will swear that the story happened right there, not in some faraway place, right wherever you happen to be. So, I've given up on trying to figure out where it really did happen. But people agree about this thing. It all started a long time ago in a very small town. There was a girl living in that town who was so beautiful, people said she had to be the prettiest girl for 500 miles around. Some people said she was the most beautiful girl in the whole world. And that girl's name was Maria. But because Maria was so beautiful, she thought she was better than everyone else. And she deserved the very best of everything. She came from a good, hard-working family. They had a nice home. She had pretty clothes to wear. But she was not satisfied. She deserved much better things. And when she was a young woman, she would have nothing to do with the young men from her town or the villages nearby. They weren't good enough for her. Many times, when she was walking with her grandma in the evening, the way young people used to do back in the old days, she would tell her grandma, "Abuelita, cuando yo me casé, voy a casarme con el hombre más guapo de todo el mundo." "Grandma," she would say, "when I get married, I'm going to marry the most handsome man in the world." And her grandma would just shake her head. But Maria would go on. She'd look out across the hillside and say, "His hair will be as black and as shiny as the raven sitting on that tree over there. And when he moves, he will be as strong and as graceful as the stallion my abuelito has in his corral." And her grandma would tell her, "Maria, caras vemos, corazones no sabemos." It's an old saying. It means we can see people's faces, caras vemos. We don't know what's in their hearts, corazones no sabemos. And she would tell her, "If you're going to marry a man, you be sure he's a good man, that he has a good heart in him. Why are you always talking about what his face looks like?" But Maria thought, "Oh, these old people, they have old-fashioned ideas. They don't know anything." And she wouldn't listen to her grandma. And then one day, a man came to town, and he seemed to be just the man she had been talking about. He had been a cowboy out on the Llano Estacado, and he could ride anything. In fact, if he was riding a horse and he got well trained, he would give that horse away and go rope him a wild horse. He thought it wasn't manly for him to ride a horse that wasn't half wild. And he was handsome. All the girls were falling in love with him. He could play guitar. He could sing beautifully. And Maria made up her mind. That was the man she would marry. But I told you how proud she was. So of course, she would never let on. If they would pass on the street and he would say hello, she would just look away. He came to her house in the evening and played his guitar and sang for her. She would even come to the window, and before long, the cowboy made up his mind. That proud girl, Maria, I can win her heart. I think I'll marry that girl. So things turned out just the way Maria wanted them to. And before long, they were going to be married. Her parents told her, "Don't marry him. He won't make a good, steady husband." But she wouldn't listen to her parents. She got married. And for a while, things were fine. They had 2 children. They seemed to be a happy family together. But after a few years, the cowboy went back to the wild life of the prairies. He would leave town and be gone for months at a time. And when he came home, he would tell Maria, "I didn't come to see you. I just want to visit my children for a while." He would sit and play with the children. Then he would go off to the bars and drink wine and gamble all night long with his friends. He talked about putting Maria aside and marrying a rich woman. Well, as proud as Maria was, she became very jealous. And also, she began to feel jealous of her own children because he paid attention to them, but he just ignored her. And one evening, she was standing in front of the house with 2 children beside her, and he came riding by in a carriage with an elegant lady on the seat beside him. He stopped and he spoke to his children, but he didn't even look at Maria. He just drove on up the street. And when that happened, something just seemed to just snap inside Maria. She felt such anger and such jealousy, and it all turned against her children. She grabbed her 2 children by the arm, and she dragged them with her down to the river. And even though it's a sad thing to tell, the story says that she threw her own children into the river. But as they disappeared down the stream, she realized what she had done, and she ran down the bank of the river, reaching out her arms as if she could get them back from the water. but they were long gone. She ran on, driven by the guilt and the anger that was filling her heart. She wasn't paying attention to where she was going, and her foot caught on a root. She tripped and fell forward, and her forehead struck a rock, and she was killed. The next day, they looked for her all over town, and they couldn't find her. And then someone brought the word into town that her body was out there on the bank of the river. They went out and found her, and they laid her to rest on the very spot where she had fallen. But the first night she was in the grave, she could not rest in peace. She was up and walking all along the bank of the river. She was dressed in a long, winding white sheet, the way a body is dressed for burial. They saw her moving among the trees, and they could hear her voice crying and crying through the night. Sometimes they thought it was just the wind that they heard. But other times, if they listened more carefully, they were sure they could hear words. It would sound something like this. Where are my children? She was crying. ¿Dónde están mis hijos? And she went all up and down the banks of the river, through all the arroyos into the mountains, down along ditches and canals and acequias. Night after night they saw her, but especially they would hear her crying outside. And so, before long, no one spoke of her as Maria anymore. They called her La Llorona, the crying woman, La Llorona. And they told the children, when it gets dark, get back inside the house, because La Llorona could be around here looking for her children. And she's crazy, so crazy. If she sees you, she won't know if it's you or her own child. She'll pick you up and carry you away, or she'll throw you into the river like she did to her own children, and you will never be seen again. And they say that down through the years, many children have been carried away by La Llorona. One man even told me this. When he was a boy, he had a friend who did not believe that story. His friend would say, "Oh, that's a story parents made up to scare kids and make them go home at night. There's no such thing as La Llorona." Well, the boys were down by the river one evening, and it got late. The other boys all said, "Look, it's getting dark. We'd better get home." Not that one boy. He said, "No, I'm having fun. I'm going to stay right here." They couldn't believe it. They said, "Aren't you afraid of La Llorona?" And he just laughed at them. "Come on. You don't believe that, do you? There's no such thing." So they went home, and he stayed there all by himself. He was throwing cans and sticks into the river, hitting them with rocks as they came by. It got really dark, and then the moon started to rise. Then, all of a sudden, he felt like an icy cold wind was blowing through his clothes, and all around him there were dogs barking. He looked around, and there was a white shape coming through the trees and getting nearer. He tried to turn and run, but he was so frightened he couldn't move. He just stood there, trembling, and the shape got closer until he could hear that high wailing. But still, he couldn't run away. So he crouched down as small as he could. He just hoped she wouldn't see him. Suddenly, he heard her say, "Mi hijo, my child," she said, and came toward him. His face was as white as the sheet that La Llorona was wearing, but he couldn't run away. She came up to him, reached out with her long, twisted fingers, and she took hold of his shoulders. When La Llorona's fingers touched his shoulders, it felt like icicles were cutting into his skin. Just then, when La Llorona was about to pick him up and carry him away, back in town, the church bell started ringing, calling the people for Mass. And when the church bell rang, a prayer went through the boy's mind. And when that happened, La Llorona dropped him and she disappeared through the trees. He stayed there for a long time before he had his strength back. Finally, he was able to run home. And when he got home, his mother was angry. She said, "Where have you been? You should have been home hours ago." He stuttered and stammered. Mama, La Llorona," she said. "What? Don't you go making up stories about La Llorona. You should have been home a long time ago." She reached out, and she was going to give him a good shaking. But when she reached out to take hold of his shoulders, then she saw on each shoulder there were 5 round red marks, like 5 blood stains. They had been left by La Llorona's fingers. Then she believed him. She took that shirt and washed it over and over, but she could never get the stains out. And the man who told me about that said when he was a boy, she would come around the neighborhood and show them the shirt. She would say, "Look here. You can just count these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those red marks were left by La Llorona's fingers. When it gets dark, get home because La Llorona can carry children away." And you can bet the kids in that neighborhood got home when they got dark. But I've never seen that shirt, so I'm not going to swear that that story's true.